In early 1943, the Allied powers faced a critical strategic challenge in the Mediterranean. After successfully pushing Axis forces out of North Africa, the next logical step was clear. The Allies needed to invade southern Europe. The most obvious target was the island of Sicily. Sicily was not just another piece of land, it was the gateway to Italy. Whoever controlled Sicily could dominate the central Mediterranean. From its airfields and ports, armies could launch attacks into mainland Italy, disrupt Axis supply lines, and open a path toward the heart of Europe. Capturing the island would weaken the Axis alliance and potentially force Italy out of the war. But there was a serious problem. The same logic that made Sicily the perfect target for the Allies made it equally obvious to the Axis powers. German and Italian military leaders already believed that Sicily would be the next place the Allies would strike, and they were preparing for it. The island was heavily fortified. Coastal defenses were reinforced, minefields were placed along likely landing beaches, and thousands of German and Italian troops were stationed across the island. Airfields were ready to launch fighter aircraft against incoming Allied bombers and landing forces. If the Allies attacked Sicily directly without any form of deception, they would be walking straight into a prepared defensive wall. The result could be catastrophic. An amphibious invasion requires surprise. Without it, soldiers landing on beaches become easy targets for artillery, machine guns, and airstrikes. History had already shown how dangerous such operations could be when the enemy was ready. Allied commanders understood that if Germany concentrated enough troops on Sicily, the invasion could turn into a disaster, costing tens of thousands of lives. So the Allies faced a dangerous dilemma. They needed to invade Sicily, but they also needed Germany to believe the invasion would happen somewhere else. Solving that problem would require one of the most unusual and daring deception plans in the entire war: Operation Mincemeat. By early 1943, the leadership of Nazi Germany was carefully studying the situation in the Mediterranean. After the Axis defeat in North Africa, it became increasingly clear that the Allies would soon attempt an invasion somewhere in southern Europe. For German strategists, the most obvious target was the island of Sicily. Its location made it the perfect stepping stone between North Africa and mainland Italy. From Sicily, the Allies could open a direct path into Italy and threaten the entire Axis position in the Mediterranean. Because of this, German military analysts began predicting that Sicily would almost certainly be the next battlefield. And their prediction was not wrong. Inside Allied command, the invasion plan for the island was already being prepared under the codename Allied Invasion of Sicily. But the Allies soon realized a terrifying problem. The Germans were thinking exactly the same way they were. German intelligence officers were monitoring Allied movements, intercepting communications, and analyzing troop buildups in North Africa. Every sign pointed toward a major amphibious operation. To them, Sicily was the logical destination. As these predictions spread through the German high command, preparations began. Additional troops were moved into the region, defensive positions were strengthened along the coastline. Air patrols increased, and anti-aircraft defenses were expanded around important ports and airfields. Commanders expected that Allied ships would soon appear on the horizon. For the Allies, this prediction created a dangerous situation. If the Germans concentrated their forces on Sicily, the invasion could become extremely costly. Thousands of soldiers could die before even reaching the beaches. Amphibious landings depend heavily on surprise, and in this case, surprise seemed almost impossible. The Allies were now facing an enemy who was already waiting for them. Unless something extraordinary happened, the invasion would walk straight into a prepared defense. To succeed, the Allies needed Germany to believe something completely different, that the real invasion would take place somewhere far away from Sicily. And that realization would soon lead British intelligence to design one of the boldest deception plans of the entire war, Operation Mincemeat. As the danger became clear, British intelligence officers began searching for a way to mislead Germany about the location of the upcoming invasion. Simply hiding the preparations for the attack was no longer enough. German intelligence was already watching the Mediterranean closely, studying every movement of Allied troops and ships. If the Allies wanted the invasion to succeed, they needed something far more powerful than secrecy. They needed deception. Inside British intelligence headquarters in London, members of MI5 began discussing how they could trick German intelligence into believing the invasion would happen somewhere other than Sicily. Among the officers working on this problem were two intelligence planners, Ewan Montagu and Charles Cholmondeley. They knew that the Germans relied heavily on captured documents and intercepted information. If German intelligence could obtain what appeared to be secret Allied plans, they would likely trust those documents. But this created a difficult question. How could the Allies deliver false secret documents directly into the hands of the enemy without revealing that it was a trap? During one brainstorming session, an unusual idea began to take shape. What if the documents were lost in a way that looked completely accidental? Not dropped by a spy, not sent through a risky agent. Instead, the documents would be carried by someone who could never speak, someone who could never reveal the truth. The plan was both strange and unsettling. British intelligence would place fake invasion plans on a dead body, give the body the identity of a military officer, and allow it to wash ashore in a location where German agents were likely to find it. If everything worked perfectly, the enemy would believe the documents were real. What began as a bizarre suggestion slowly evolved into a carefully designed deception strategy. The plan would later become known as one of the most daring intelligence operations of the entire war, Operation Mincemeat. For the deception to work, the body could not simply carry fake documents. The entire story surrounding the officer had to feel completely real. German intelligence was careful and experienced. If even a small detail seemed suspicious, the entire plan could collapse. British intelligence understood that they needed to create not just a name, but an entire life. The fictional officer would be known as William Martin, a captain in the Royal Marines. But a name alone was not enough. Real people leave traces of their lives everywhere, in letters, in photographs, in small personal belongings. To convince the Germans, Major Martin needed to look like a real man who had lived a real life. So British intelligence began carefully constructing his identity. They placed official military identification papers on the body. His uniform was prepared to match that of a Royal Marines officer. In his pockets were everyday items that an officer might carry: keys, receipts, theater ticket stubs, and even a bank notice about an unpaid bill. These small details were extremely important. Intelligence officers knew that if German analysts studied the body and its belongings, they would search for signs of authenticity. The more ordinary the items appeared, the more convincing the story would become. But the most powerful detail was deeply personal. Inside his pocket was a photograph of a young woman, his supposed fiancée, named Pam. Alongside the photo was a love letter written in a warm and affectionate tone, filled with the kind of emotions only a real relationship would contain. These intimate details transformed Major Martin from a simple identity into a believable human being. A man with a job, a man with a fiancée, a man with unfinished business back home. To anyone examining the body, it would appear to be a tragic accident, a British officer who had died while carrying important military documents. And that illusion was exactly what British intelligence needed to make their daring deception succeed as part of Operation Mincemeat. Creating the identity of Major Martin was only the beginning. British intelligence knew that a simple name and uniform would not be enough to fool experienced German analysts. To make the deception believable, they had to build an entire life around the fictional officer. Every detail had to feel authentic. The team working on the operation began carefully designing what intelligence officers later called a pocket litter, the small personal items that people naturally carry in their pockets every day. These ordinary objects would quietly tell the story of a real person. Inside Major Martin's pockets, they placed personal letters, receipts, and everyday belongings that reflected the life of a British officer. One of the most important items was a letter from his supposed fiancée, Pam. The letter was affectionate and slightly playful, written in the tone of a young woman writing to the man she loved. Alongside the letter was her photograph, showing a smiling woman who seemed completely real. These small emotional details were incredibly powerful. They transformed the identity from a simple cover story into something human and believable. But the illusion did not stop there. Major Martin also carried a bank notice warning him about an overdraft, a small financial problem that many people experience in real life. He had a receipt for a recent purchase, theater ticket stubs, and keys on a keychain. Each item was carefully chosen to make his life appear ordinary and authentic. Even the placement of the items inside his pockets was carefully considered. British intelligence understood that German investigators would examine everything closely. They would check whether the objects looked naturally worn, whether the letters were folded realistically, and whether the story behind the officer made sense. Everything had to feel natural. The goal was simple. If German intelligence studied the body and its belongings, they would not see a staged deception. Instead, they would see the tragic death of a real officer carrying important documents. A man with a relationship, a man with personal problems, a man with a life waiting for him back home. In reality, none of it had ever existed. But if the plan worked, this carefully constructed life would help convince the enemy to believe the false invasion plans carried as part of Operation Mincemeat. At the heart of the entire deception were the documents Major Martin was supposed to be carrying. These papers were the real weapon of the operation. If German intelligence believed the documents were authentic, the entire strategy could succeed. But if the papers looked suspicious or poorly designed, the deception would collapse immediately. British intelligence needed the documents to appear absolutely genuine. To achieve this, the team carefully created a set of secret military letters that looked exactly like real communications between high-ranking Allied officers. The letters discussed upcoming military plans in a natural and informal tone, as if they were a routine correspondence between commanders. The most important letter appeared to come from Archibald Nye, the Vice Chief of the Imperial General Staff. It was addressed to Harold Alexander, one of the senior Allied commanders in the Mediterranean. Inside the letter, the writer casually mentioned future invasion plans. But instead of suggesting Sicily as the main target, the message hinted that the Allies were preparing major attacks on Greece and possibly the island of Sardinia. This was exactly what British intelligence wanted the Germans to believe. The wording of the letter was carefully designed. It did not look like a formal invasion plan. Instead, it sounded like a normal conversation between officers discussing strategic possibilities. This subtle approach made the document feel more authentic. If German intelligence found the letter, they would likely assume they had discovered a secret communication that was never meant to fall into enemy hands. The documents were then placed inside a briefcase attached to Major Martin's wrist with a chain, just as a real courier carrying sensitive information might do. The briefcase was waterproofed as much as possible to ensure the papers would survive the journey at sea. Every detail was planned.
If the body was discovered and the documents reached German intelligence, the enemy would believe they had uncovered valuable secret information about Allied strategy. And that false information would lead them to expect an invasion far away from the real target, the island of Sicily, where the Allies were preparing the operation known as Allied Invasion of Sicily. The success of the deception now depended on whether the enemy would take the bait laid by Operation Mincemeat.
With the identity prepared and the secret documents ready, British intelligence now faced the most unusual and sensitive part of the entire operation. They needed a body. The plan depended on releasing a dead man into the sea so that it would appear he had died in an accident while transporting secret military documents. But the body had to match the story perfectly. If investigators suspected the death was unnatural or staged, the deception could immediately fall apart. So the search began for someone who could quietly become the messenger of the operation. Eventually, British intelligence obtained the body of a man named Glyndwr Michael. Michael had died in London after ingesting rat poison, and he had no close family who might question what happened to him afterward. His body was carefully preserved while intelligence officers examined whether it could support the story they were creating. The plan required that the man appear to have died in a plane crash at sea. After the crash, his body would have floated in the water for some time before washing ashore. British pathologists studied whether the condition of the body would support that explanation. After careful evaluation, the decision was made. Glyndwr Michael would become Major William Martin. His body was dressed in the uniform of a Royal Marines officer. The carefully prepared identification documents were placed on him. Personal belongings were arranged in his pockets, including the letters from his fictional fiancée and the small everyday items that told the story of a normal life. Finally, the most important object was attached to his wrist, the briefcase containing the secret documents. To any observer, it would look like a tragic accident, a courier officer who had died while carrying important military plans. But in reality, this silent messenger was about to deliver one of the most carefully constructed deceptions of the entire war. Once everything was prepared, the body was placed inside a sealed container and transported toward the Mediterranean. The next stage of the plan would take it closer to enemy intelligence than any spy could safely go. And the fate of the deception now rested on whether this unusual messenger could help convince the enemy to believe the story behind Operation Mincemeat. With every detail carefully prepared, the next stage of the operation began: transporting Major Martin to the Mediterranean. The body was placed inside a sealed metal container filled with dry ice. The cold temperature slowed decomposition and preserved the body during the long journey. To anyone who saw the container, it was described simply as special military cargo. The responsibility for transporting it fell to the British submarine HMS Seraph. Under the command of Norman Jewell, the submarine quietly departed from Britain and began its long journey toward the coast of Spain. The location had been carefully chosen. Spain was officially neutral during the war, but German intelligence agents operated actively there. British planners believed that if the body washed ashore along the Spanish coastline, local authorities would likely recover it, and German intelligence would eventually gain access to whatever documents it carried. After days of traveling underwater across the Atlantic and through the Mediterranean, the submarine approached its destination near the southern coast of Spain. The crew had been informed about the secret mission, but the strange nature of the cargo left many of them uneasy. Transporting a body across the sea as part of a military deception was unlike anything they had experienced before. In the early hours of the morning, the submarine surfaced quietly in the dark waters near the coast. The moment had finally arrived. The container was opened, revealing the body dressed as Major William Martin, complete with uniform, identification papers, personal belongings, and the chained briefcase containing the secret documents. Before releasing the body, Commander Jewell reportedly read a brief prayer, giving the man a final moment of respect. Then, the body was gently placed into the sea. Slowly, the silent messenger began drifting with the currents toward the Spanish shore. Now, the success of the plan depended entirely on chance, on whether the body would be discovered, whether the documents would be examined, and whether German intelligence would believe the carefully constructed story behind Operation Mincemeat. Once the HMS Seraph reached the designated coordinates off the southern coast of Spain, the operation entered its most delicate phase, releasing Major Martin into the open waters. The container, carefully sealed to protect the body and its precious cargo, was gently lowered into the sea. Dry ice within the container ensured that the body would remain preserved during its slow drift toward shore. Every motion was precise. A single mistake could damage the documents or draw unwanted attention. The crew watched in tense silence as the officer began his final journey. To any observer from afar, it was simply cargo cast into the waves, but for British intelligence, this moment carried enormous stakes. The plan relied on a combination of meticulous preparation and luck. Ocean currents, tides, and weather would determine whether the body would reach land, and if it did, whether local authorities would handle it in a way that brought it into German hands. Timing was also crucial. The body had to appear as though it had washed ashore naturally after some days at sea. Any evidence that suggested tampering or deliberate placement could expose the operation. As the submarine withdrew quietly into the night, the officers could only hope the currents would guide Major Martin to the intended stretch of coast. This drop marked the pivotal moment where careful planning met unpredictable nature. The silent messenger, floating adrift, now carried with him a deception that could mislead one of the most formidable military intelligence organizations in the world. Soon, the fate of the Allied invasion of Sicily would hinge on whether German intelligence would accept the story told by a dead man in the documents he carried, the core of Operation Mincemeat. After drifting silently for several days, Major Martin's body finally reached the shore near Huelva, Spain. Spanish fishermen were the first to spot the figure, lying half-submerged on the beach. At first glance, it appeared to be the tragic death of a British officer lost at sea. Nothing seemed unusual beyond the sad circumstances. Local authorities were quickly notified. They recovered the body and examined it carefully. Everything seemed meticulously placed. The Royal Marines uniform, identification papers, and personal belongings all pointed to a real officer. Even the small, intimate details, like the photograph of his fiancée, Pam, and the letters tucked into his pockets, gave the impression of authenticity. The most critical item, of course, was the briefcase chained to his wrist, containing the secret documents hinting at Allied plans. The Spanish authorities treated the documents as classified intelligence, and due to Spain's delicate political position, they eventually shared copies with German intelligence officers operating in the country. German agents, eager for any credible information, examined the materials carefully. The attention to detail, the personal letters, receipts, and mundane objects that created a believable life convinced them almost immediately. To the Germans, this was a real, dead British officer delivering important intelligence that had accidentally fallen into their hands. For British intelligence, this discovery was a moment of suspense and relief. Every item had landed exactly as intended. The silent messenger had successfully delivered his cargo, and the Germans were now unknowingly taking the bait. The stage was set for the next part of the deception, convincing Hitler in the German High Command that the Allies planned their invasion far from Sicily, shifting the course of the war without firing a single shot. This discovery on the shore marked the turning point of Operation Mincemeat, where meticulous planning met the unpredictable reality of the world, and a dead man became the most convincing spy in history. Once Spanish authorities had recovered Major Martin's body in the briefcase, the intelligence trail quickly led to German hands. Despite Spain's official neutrality, German agents had long infiltrated the region, monitoring coastal activity and keeping tabs on Allied operations. The moment the documents surfaced, they were seized, copied, and analyzed with the utmost care. To the Germans, the evidence seemed overwhelmingly credible. The combination of a dead British officer, the meticulously crafted personal items, and the apparently authentic letters created the illusion of a routine intelligence mishap, a courier killed while transporting secret plans. Everything suggested that the documents were genuine. The letters contained exactly the information British intelligence wanted the Germans to see, hints that the Allies were preparing to invade Greece and Sardinia, far from Sicily. The tone of the correspondence, casual and informal, reinforced the illusion that this was a real officer communicating sensitive plans accidentally exposed to the enemy. German intelligence quickly shared their findings with high command. Every copy, every note, every detail was scrutinized. Analysts studied the personal letters, the photograph of Pam, even the mundane receipts tucked into the pockets. Each small element reinforced the story that this was a real man with a real life, now tragically lost while carrying highly confidential information. From the German perspective, the documents were a goldmine. They offered insight into Allied intentions, troop movements, and strategic priorities. And the deception worked so well that Germany's high command began to believe that the main invasion would target Greece, exactly what the British had planned. The stage was now set for the next critical step, manipulating Hitler and the German generals to move their forces away from Sicily, ensuring that the real Allied invasion would face far less resistance. In the hands of the enemy, Major Martin's briefcase had become a silent weapon of war, a deception that could alter the course of the Mediterranean campaign, all without firing a single shot. This was the true genius of Operation Mincemeat. By the time the documents had reached German high command, they were being examined with intense scrutiny. Every line, every personal detail, every hint of strategy was analyzed as if it were the key to anticipating the next Allied move. The deception worked exactly as British intelligence had hoped. Hitler and his generals were convinced that the Allies were planning an invasion of Greece and Sardinia, not Sicily. The carefully constructed personal details, a dead officer with letters, receipts, and a photograph of his fiancée, made the story feel authentic. To them, this was not a trick, it was a rare stroke of good fortune. A courier officer had died accidentally while carrying vital intelligence. Hitler, notoriously cautious about Mediterranean operations, acted decisively. Troops that could have reinforced Sicily were redirected to Greece. Panzer divisions and coastal defenses were repositioned hundreds of miles away from the true target. German naval and air units were ordered to focus their surveillance and defense efforts on regions that were entirely irrelevant to the actual invasion. This was exactly what the Allies needed. By convincing the enemy that their main attack would happen somewhere else, the British created the element of surprise, the single most important factor in a successful amphibious invasion. For British intelligence, this was a moment of triumph. A combination of creativity, meticulous planning, and daring had successfully manipulated one of the most formidable military leaders in history. Hitler had taken the bait, unknowingly playing into the hands of the Allies. The next step was inevitable. With German attention focused elsewhere, the Allies could launch their true invasion on Sicily with greatly reduced resistance, setting the stage for a campaign that would change the course of the Mediterranean theater. This moment marked the pinnacle of Operation Mincemeat. A dead man and a clever ruse had outsmarted Hitler himself. With Hitler and the German high command convinced that the Allies' main target was Greece, the consequences were immediate and dramatic. Units that might have strengthened Sicily's defenses were instead redeployed thousands of miles away, leaving the island far more vulnerable than expected. Panzer divisions, coastal artillery, and Luftwaffe squadrons were shifted eastward following the false intelligence. Entire supply lines were redirected, and strategic positions that had been heavily fortified were suddenly left undermanned. German commanders trusted the documents implicitly. Every personal detail, the photograph of Pam, the letters, the ordinary receipts, had reinforced the illusion of authenticity. Meanwhile, Allied reconnaissance confirmed that German troop movements were aligning perfectly with the deception. Coastal defenses on Sicily were weaker, reinforcements were delayed, and key landing zones were less guarded. The Germans had fallen completely into the trap laid by Operation Mincemeat. The operation's brilliance lay in its simplicity and subtlety. Without firing a shot, the Allies had forced the enemy to make critical strategic errors. Entire German divisions were now stationed where no invasion would ever occur, leaving Sicily largely exposed for the impending Allied attack. For British planners, watching the enemy act exactly as intended was confirmation that their audacious plan had worked. The carefully constructed ruse of Major William Martin had manipulated not only the intelligence analysts, but also the strategic decisions of one of the most powerful militaries in the world. By the time the invasion began, the Germans were fighting a battle on the wrong front, a direct result of a dead man, a briefcase, and a brilliant act of deception. With German forces misled and their defenses weakened, the stage was set for the Allied invasion of Sicily, the operation that would finally bring the Mediterranean campaign to a decisive turning point. On July 9, 1943, Allied troops launched Allied invasion of Sicily. Thousands of soldiers stormed the beaches, supported by massive naval bombardments and coordinated airstrikes. Unlike a typical amphibious assault facing full-strength defenses, the Allies encountered significantly lighter resistance at key landing points. The success of the invasion was amplified by the Germans' misplacement of their forces. Panzer divisions and coastal units that might have turned the tide had been stationed hundreds of miles away, preparing for an attack that would never come. The deception created both a strategic and psychological advantage, catching German commanders off guard and throwing their plans into disarray. As troops pushed inland, capturing towns and strategic positions, the Allies gained momentum with far fewer casualties than expected. The operation's speed and effectiveness were in large part thanks to the silent manipulation of the enemy through the clever ruse of Major William Martin. The invasion of Sicily marked the beginning of the end for Axis control over Italy. Italian forces were demoralized, German commanders struggled to adapt, and the Allies established a crucial foothold on the Italian mainland. It was a victory achieved not only through planning and courage, but also through one of the most audacious intelligence operations of the war, Operation Mincemeat. A single dead man, drifting silently toward shore with a briefcase of false intelligence, had helped shape the outcome of a major campaign, proving that sometimes the mind can be a more powerful weapon than any army. The success of Operation Mincemeat did not end with the invasion of Sicily. Its impact reverberated throughout the rest of World War II, demonstrating the immense power of intelligence, creativity, and audacity in warfare. By convincing Hitler and the German High Command to redeploy troops away from Sicily, the Allies gained a crucial advantage with minimal loss of life. The deception bought time, reduced casualties, and allowed the invasion to proceed more smoothly than anyone had dared hope. Operation Mincemeat became a textbook example of psychological warfare. It showcased how a single, carefully constructed lie, carried by a dead man, could manipulate entire armies, redirect strategies, and alter the course of a major campaign. Intelligence officers realized that war was not only fought with guns and tanks, but also with ideas, information, and meticulous attention to detail. The story of Major William Martin, Glyndwr Michael, and the documents he carried became legendary. It proved that even the smallest and quietest players in the theater of war, in this case, a dead man and a briefcase, could shape global events in unimaginable ways. Historians and military analysts today regard Operation Mincemeat as one of the most brilliant deceptions in military history. It is remembered not just for its creativity, but for the tangible strategic advantage it provided, the successful invasion of Sicily and the beginning of the Allies' push into mainland Europe. In the end, the operation stands as a testament to the extraordinary lengths human ingenuity can reach in times of war. A story where meticulous planning, audacious imagination, and a little bit of luck combined to change the war without firing a single shot. This was the ultimate legacy of Operation Mincemeat, a deception that truly changed the course of history.